Let's talk first of all about what is going on with striking teachers and NHS workers with Jonathan Gullis. He's a Conservative MP. He's also former School Standards Minister and, when he was a teacher, a union rep as well. Good morning to you, Jonathan.
Hey up, Julia, how are you? And a happy belated Staffordshire Day as well. Yesterday was Staffordshire Day, and I'm sure you enjoyed an oat cake with your husband to celebrate the great county of Staffordshire and, of course, the city of Stoke-on-Trent.
Never once did not get it in. Right, we're finished. Never say you don't big up your city and your county. Never say that, Jonathan. Always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us. Look, there's lots to talk about the NHS strikes and teacher strike. I want to start with the NHS strikes. This meeting today, the NHS Staff Council, all the different unions representing the NHS, they're going to be meeting today themselves. They're going to have a vote on whether they back the government's latest payoff of 5% rise plus lump sums between about 1,600 and 3,800 for staff for this year. But then they're going to meet with the Department for Health. Do you think there's a likelihood we could see an end of those strikes, given that they're already upgrading again? And we saw, nurses walking out of cancer wards and nurses refusing to work in A&E when they were in crisis over the weekend?
Well, look, I think it's important to say, first of all, that, I, like the public, totally understand and respect the incredible hard work that nurses and other NHS staff undertake on a daily basis to keep us safe, keep us well, help us heal. But ultimately, this has sadly got quite messy, with a number of unions having accepted the offer and others not accepting it, albeit by a very small margin in that instance. So I think that the best thing that can happen, hopefully, is consensus comes out of today with all these NHS unions, and that ultimately the pay offer is accepted, because what's really important is to rebuild that trust in our National Health Service by making sure that backlog is tackled, one of the Prime Minister's 5 pledges, which is so important.
Well, the nurses and other health workers say that the reason why we're going out is not just about pay, it's about the fact we haven't got enough people, and that's partly to do with pay, partly conditions, but again, all tied in with pay. We can't recruit enough people. We can't retain enough people. We've got massive shortages. Working conditions, therefore, are much harder. And that makes the people who are still there go, I'm done. I can't deal with the stress anymore. Fundamentally, if this was the private sector, we'd be throwing more money to these people. When we couldn't get a tanker driver, do you remember, a couple of years ago, couldn't get any drivers? What did those companies do? They started throwing bonuses. 10 grand, come and join my company and drive a lorry or whatever it was. Well, we don't do that in the monolithic NHS. Is that why we've got a problem? Do we need to just pay them more?
Well, let's not forget, Julia, now it's £167 billion a year is going into the NHS. This is British taxpayers'
where is it going?
Money. Well, so Julia, I totally accept that there is clearly, money that's not getting down to the front line as it should be. In Stoke-on-Trent, I have 4 different NHS trusts. That is 4 trusts, 4 CEOs, 4 boards of directors, 4 administrative offices as well that ultimately need to function. That is clearly an area that we should be looking at about whether or not money can be saved just in that small example locally, as well as these PFI deals that obviously are crippling NHS trusts as well. In Stoke, again, £20 million a year not being spent on the front line to service the debt from the PFI that Andy Burnham, the Labour Party, built back in 2008. So I think these are areas that we need to have those frank and honest discussions about, to find out, like you say, how we can get money down to the front line to make sure those money is going into recruiting and retaining those highly skilled and qualified individuals that we need. I mean,
really interesting report over the weekend, top surgeons are saying they're only able to do surgery once or twice a week, or even once a fortnight on occasion, because they can't get all the other staff, the anaesthetists, the nursing teams in the operating theatres. And so you've got this massive backlog of people. We've got people who want to work and they can't do the actual job they're paid to do. And of course, there's also a risk. If they're not operating on a regular basis, their skill level goes down and they're a greater risk. I mean, it's just a disaster we're walking into. A longer term disaster, I would say, when it comes to education. Kids out of school again today, like they were last Thursday. I mean, basically haven't had a full week of school in quite a few weeks now. This as we head into GCSEs and A-levels. My daughter's got a GCSE starting on Friday. I mean, luckily she hasn't got teachers on strike at her school today, but, millions of other children are off school, parents off work. How are we going to resolve this?
Well, first of all, best of luck to your daughter and to all those children undertaking their examinations, because I know how stressful a time that is for pupils and for teachers as well as parents. What I'm very angry about is the National Education Union, Julia. Sadly, their leaders, and specifically Kevin Courtney and Mary Balstead, seem to be more focused on trying to live out their socialist utopian fantasy rather than actually being proactive in trying to find a way forward here. Ultimately, I was the minister at the time who signed off the 5% pay increase, the largest in 30 years that teachers had in September 2020. 2022. Obviously, a 5% offer has been put on the table for September 2023. The starting salary for a teacher will begin at £30,000 a year, which is extremely competitive in a very challenging, I accept, marketplace. And of course, the ultimate reality is it's actual workload, that is the number one issue that comes up, both on surveys conducted by the Department for Education and teaching unions. And the workload is largely driven, yes, by some guidance in the Department for Education, that needs to be sorted, but head teachers are responsible for the behaviour policies, the assessment policies that are undertaken in each and every individual school. That's why we went for academisation, to empower head teachers to take the decisions for the pupils that they serve. And that is where we should be having those frank, honest conversations to reduce workload on teachers. And I hope that these teaching unions understand that they are playing with fire here. And when I say playing with fire, they are putting parents in a very difficult situation in the middle of a cost of living crisis.
Well, they would argue back. They would argue back that, you know, they're trying to save education. They know that you've got kids doing GCSE science subjects this week or next week, the week after, who've been taught by a teacher who hasn't even got a science qualification because they can't recruit anybody, because they can't pay enough to make it worth someone's while who's got that sort of qualification to go into teaching. So, you know, you could argue that there's they would say, look, you know, we're striking. We need to improve, you know, the pay and the conditions for teachers so that we can recruit better people, so that kids can get better education. They say they're on the sides of children. That's their argument.
Well, that will, of course, be their argument, but their actions say something different, in my opinion. And if you actually look at what they're saying here, you know, if you're a science teacher, not only are you getting nearly £30,000 as a golden handshake, essentially, for entering your teaching training, but obviously the starting salary is going to be at £30,000 in September 23. So we are throwing money at trying to recruit teachers. And sadly, we're still seeing a challenge in that area. And what the teaching unions have not come up with is what else can be done other than throw money at the situation, which has been going on for a number of years now. Starting salaries going up and up and up in order to try and recruit, yet numbers are still finding it challenging. And that's because behaviour and workload are the two top priorities that we should be focusing on. And those are the two things that drive people out of the profession: poor behaviour management and obviously high workload. And if we actually work together, when I was in the Department for Education, I said to the unions, I would sit down with them and love to do a review with their members to look at how we can reduce workload, how we can point to best examples, how we can cut guidance as well.
Well, we've heard this view. I was a political editor back in the 2000s. I can remember that was still being debated and demanded then. It's 2023.
Well, I like to think I'm quite a proactive person, Julian. Sadly, obviously, Rishi Sunak decided I wasn't right to stay in government, so I'm now on the back benches again. So my 51 days in the Department for Education came to it.
Didn't quite change the world. Well, I think we're all sad for that.
The world, sadly, Julian. But I can tell you that I understand the challenges that teachers are facing, because obviously my own partner is a teacher herself. Yeah. So believe me, I hear it day to day when I go home.
Yeah, but at least she doesn't have to. She has to listen to you going on about oatcakes the whole time. So I mean, you know, quid pro quo. Can I ask you about two other big stories in the news? One, front of the Guardian, up to 10 disused cruise liners, ferries, and barges are being bought, hired by the government to put into ports across the country. Liverpool expected to be next on the list to house Channel migrants. Of course, we've got that barge that's going to be down on the south coast that's going to house 500. Of course, we had one day the other week where 500 people came in on that day. So that's just, you know, we just measured migrants in a barge load. 500 means a barge load. Is that the best way to spend government money? Taxpayers' money.
Well, taxpayers' money, absolutely. Look, I personally think it is for the short term, because ultimately we need to break the incentivisation for people wanting to cross the channel. And that means if people are knowing that they're going to stay on some disused barge or ferry, that is a smarter way than telling people they could be put up in a 4-star hotel. I don't think that's appropriate. It does major damage to hospitality and retail, as well as tourism in places like Stoke-on-Trent. Right next to a levelling up project, we've got one of our hotels, which again is undermining what we want to achieve in regenerating this small but mighty city, which I know that you're passionate about, Julia, as well as your fantastic husband. So, you know, that's so important that we need to make sure that we do deliver on. So, yeah, the government has my full support in this. And I think ultimately MPs of all sides of the House are going to have to swallow maybe a bitter pill in the short term, because if we're going to try and break the smuggling gangs model, we have to make sure that there's no incentive for people coming over here. And that does mean having to take some of these migrants. Stoke-on-Trent has got 1,279 already. You know, this is a city that's been a long-term member of the Voluntary Asylum dispersal scheme. So I feel sorry for other parliamentary colleagues, but ultimately we've all got to share the burden.
We've done our bit. Just finally, also, let me ask you about Sue Gray, Partygate, of course, author of that report. Ultimately, one of the big factors that brought down Boris Johnson's premiership. She was a former senior civil servant. She undertook that reform as that investigation as a neutral, politically neutral, above the political phrase civil servant. But now it emerges that her talks with Keir Starmer and his team, basically, they were ongoing at that time when she was carrying out a highly politically sensitive investigation into the Prime Minister's party activities during lockdown. Same time, she's talking to the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, about coming to him in a highly political job as his chief of staff and advisor ahead of the next election, and if he wins the next election, on his team in number 10. This shows, we understand, a huge conflict of interest, but she can't possibly take that role now, can she? Isn't she completely exposed now as somebody who has not got the integrity we all thought she had?
I think, sadly, what has happened here is that there's been now a major undermining further in our civil service. People will question the political neutrality of civil servants, and these talks clearly have been going on for much longer than many of us thought that they had been going on for. And ultimately, there are going to have to be some very hard questions for Keir Starmer to have to answer. When, where, was there any of these conversations on the parliamentary estate? Were they held at Labour HQ? Were they held in each other's homes? These are things he's got to have to answer. And if he wants to play the integrity card, then he's better show some integrity and actually be honest with the British public about what's been going on here, instead of dodging and flip-flopping from one position to the next, as we know that he's famous for doing, whether it be from Jeremy Corbyn to his 10 pledges, one of which he's ditching again today, when he became leader, wanting to no longer abolish tuition fees. And this guy just can't be trusted. The British public don't know what he stands for nor what he believes in. And I think Sue Gray's appointment is now something that's probably for the history books, because ultimately it will just undermine credibility of the civil service and undermines Keir Starmer's credibility.
I don't think there's any question at all. We do no longer have a politically neutral. We have quite an activist civil service. However, it's not Sue Gray's fault that then Prime Minister Boris Johnson lost his job, or, for instance, Richard Sharp, the BBC chairman, has had to fall on his sword after reporting to him. Ultimately, these are mistakes that are made either by politicians or by political appointees, and the civil service gets in the middle, they might say.
Well, I would actually suggest that what's happened in the past when it comes to those type of appointments is people have fallen on their swords when it comes to things. Dominic Raab, I thought, regardless of what everyone thinks of that report, he was honest enough with the public to say, if anything was upheld, I will resign. He did that. That shows integrity and honesty in his dealings there, whilst, of course, making it clear that he feels that there was certain things that he's not happy with in that report. And I do think the civil service needs to ask themselves some hard questions internally, because ultimately, if there are, and there's, as rumoured, potentially other senior civil servants in negotiations with the Labour Party as well, then again Keir Starmer has to lay out the facts very clearly so that this can all be dealt with, and all it takes for him is to be open and honest and transparent, and we can all move on from this. But sadly, because he's burying his head in the sand, questions will prevail.
OK, thank you very much. Jonathan Gullis and his oatcakes from Staffordshire, Conservative MP. Thank you very much, D9.